truth. Today we're going to talk about, we've been talking about a series on healing and divine health, and we're talking about an area related to that's so misunderstood by so many people. Some got wrong ideals, but most people are just a little vague on what it is really, and that is the idea of unclean. And we're going to discuss unclean and what it means and why things are unclean, and the impact of unclean, of course, on health and healing. So let's begin the day. We're going to start here in Leviticus chapter 4, verses 27 through 30. If any of the common people sin through ignorance, while he does somewhat against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning the things which ought not to be done, and be guilty, or if his sin, which he has sinned, come to his knowledge, he shall bring his offering, a kid of the goats, a female without blemish, for a sin which he has sinned. He shall lay his hands upon the head of the sin offering. He shall slay the sin offering in the place of the burnt offering. And the priest shall take the blood thereof with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar, the burnt offering, and shall pour out the blood thereof at the bottom of the altar. Okay, so we're starting off by talking about the sin of ignorance to give us some context. There's two or three interesting things here you need to notice. First of all, you can sin in ignorance. And now become more abundantly clear how that can happen as we go along. Now you could not, you could just sin out knowing the law, but you could also sin without even being aware of it, as we'll look at, possibly. Now to prevent this sin of ignorance, or to be extra cautious, there's a sacrifice for it. Okay. Now if you know it, you certainly should give the sacrifice, but this thing about does someone against the commandments of the Lord, but doesn't know about it, a person can still make the sacrifice just to be safe, okay, just to be certain. So, and the other thing I'm interested in, and we'll talk about that more in a future post, is I want you to notice that the offering, a kid of the goats, has to be a female without blemish, and most time offerings are males or not specified. So it's kind of interesting in this one case, it's a female. Again, we'll discuss why in another post. I want to rabbit trail on that. On Leviticus chapter 4, 32 through 35, in chapter 4, we continue in verse 32 through 35. And if he bring a lamb for a sin offering, he shall bring it a female without blemish. He shall lay his hand upon the sin offering and slay it for the sin offering in the place where they kill the burnt offering. And the priest shall take the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of the burnt offering, and pour out the blood thereof at the bottom of the altar. And he shall take away, and he shall take away all the fat thereof, as the fat of the lamb is taken away from sacrifice of peace offerings. And the priest shall burn them upon the altar according to the burnt offerings made by fire in the Lord. The priest shall make an atonement for a sin that he has committed, and it shall be forgiven him. So again, notice that sin done in ignorance still needs to be forgiven. And as we said at the beginning, we talked about the foundation of healing. Generally speaking, when you or someone else, it could be your parents, your ancestors, someone else, but when someone sins, they open the door for the enemy to bring sickness in, and that sin needs to be repented of and also forgiven. So even a sin of ignorance needs to be done this, and sometimes that's exactly what we face. Sometimes if we're sick and people are laying hands on us and we're just not getting well, we need to ask the Lord, examine us, show us something's going on, because maybe we have a sin of ignorance that we need to repent of. And of course, our sacrifice is Messiah. We still need to confess it and repent of it. Now we're going to look at this with respect to being unclean, because there's a lot of confusion about being unclean, and that's why I'm bringing this context up. Look, we're going to the next chapter, Leviticus 5, 2 through 5. If a soul touches the unclean thing, which would be a carcass of an unclean beast, or a carcass of an unclean cattle, or a carcass of unclean creeping things, if he hid from me, shall be unclean and guilty. If he touch the cleanness of men, whether it be cleanness whatsoever the uncleanness of men, whatsoever uncleanness it be that the man be defiled with, it shall be hid, and it be hid from him, then he will know it, then he shall be guilty. And if a soul swear, pronounces his lips to evil, to do good, whatsoever should be the man pronouncing his lips, oath, and to be hid from him, we knows that he shall be guilty in one of these. And it shall be when he's guilty of one of these things, shall confess his sin in that thing. Okay, so here's where the confusion comes. People sometimes look at this out the context and think that being unclean is sinful. You'll be unclean and guilty. Well, it's not being unclean that you're guilty of anyway in the first place. It's not the uncleanness itself that's a sin. We'll examine exactly what is a sin shortly. It's related to uncleanness. But notice you can touch the uncleanness you can touch the uncleanness caused by someone else, and that can also make you unclean. You can not even know that you've done it. So in the context here, they're talking about in the temple. So if you're in the temple and have done this, then you're guilty. And we'll look at what that means here in a moment. And it's only about swearing. This whole thing about swearing, it can have for a number of reasons. First, they got in a moment of passion, said something you don't even remember. They said it later, or perhaps they were drunk and promised and swore to do something and they still don't remember it. I mean, they shouldn't get drunk. That's a sin of itself, but that's the kind of thing it's talking about there. Again, the whole context is sin of ignorance. The divider between 4 and 5 was just put in there by when they made the Geneva Bible, who made the system of chapters and verses. It's all the same passage if you look at it. It's about the sin of ignorance. They just specialized and broke it so it wouldn't be too long of a chapter. Now we're going to look at this thing about unclean, and we're going to see how serious, get some idea what when it's sin and how serious of sin this is. Leviticus chapter 7, verses 19 through 21. And the flesh that touches the unclean thing shall not be eaten; it shall be burned with fire. As for the flesh, all that be clean thereof all that are clean be clean there shall eat thereof. But the soul that eats of the flesh, the sacrifice of peace offering, that pertains to the Lord, having his uncleanness upon him, even that soul shall be cut off from his people. Moreover, the soul that shall touch the unclean thing, as the uncleanness of man or any unclean beast, or any abominable unclean thing, and eat the flesh, the sacrifice of peace offerings, pertaining to the Lord, even that soul shall be cut off from his people. Okay, so what is sin is being in an unclean state. In eating the sacrifice to the Lord, you're in an unclean state. Now, this thing here, the flesh touches the unclean thing shall not be eaten. It's talking about like if they had some of the flesh, the sacrifice, and he got all cooked or whatever, and then something causes it to become unclean. And we'll explain what can cause it to become unclean in a little bit. You're to burn it with fire, but the rest of it, all are clean. That means the people are clean, who have no uncleanness on them, who've had their uncleanness cleansed. Okay. But notice if you go around, and it gives you a little list of things you can do to become unclean. Touch an unclean thing as an uncleanness of man, which we'll explain, or an unclean beast, and we'll explain the conditions of that, or an abominable unclean thing. We'll explain that as we go along. And then you're in an unclean state and you still eat these, you're going to be cut off from his people, which at a minimum means you're going to be exiled and no longer part of the people of Israel. But it can also mean, that same expression is also used of killed, cut off from the people through death, to the rest of the people through death. Okay. So God takes this business of showing up unclean and eating his sacrifice eating his sacrifice while you're unclean, super serious. And we'll get into why he takes super serious in a little bit as we go along, you'll see. Now we continue on here in Leviticus 15, 31 through 33. Thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, that they die not in their uncleanness when they defile that my tabernacle is among them. This is the law of him that has an issue, of him whose seed goes from him and is defiled therewith. And of her that is sick of her flowers, and of him that has an issue, of the man and of the woman, of him that lies with her that is unclean. So notice the children of Israel will be separated from their uncleanness. Now remember, the temple, there's a court, a large court, the court of the Gentiles you can come into. There's a court of the Israelites, and that's what Paul, we looked at before, was accused of violating, of bringing an unclean person into it. And that's defiling the tabernacle. And notice that they do this, the penalty is death. Not just exile and no longer considered part of the people of Israel, it is death. And so we talked about before, the Soreg had warnings about that, all, on signs in many languages all around it, the wall of separation. So, and then it goes on in some ways, it goes on, he has spelled out some laws about what makes clean unclean, and how to avoid it. And we'll talk about these issues here, these additional issues here that are now new as we go along. In future lessons, we'll go into more detail about them. Now we continue on in Leviticus. We go to Leviticus 22, chapter 22, verses 1 through 3, and again about how serious this uncleanness business is. In the Lord coming to the temple in an unclean state, I want to phrase that. In the temple, I mean the area of the Israelites, the courtyard of the Israelites, or closer to God, because the ideal, closer you get to the Holy of Holies, the closer you are to the Father. So you're being separated. Each one of those requires more, has more requirements of the person. There's more separation. Now this is talking about the priest who can go there where most of the children of Israel cannot go. Speaking to Aaron and his sons, they separate themselves. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speaking of Aaron and his sons, and they separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, they profane not my holy name in those things which they have hallowed unto me. I am the Lord. Say unto them, whosoever be of all your seed among your generation, that goes unto the holy things which the children of Israel shall hallow unto the Lord, having his uncleanness upon him, that so shall be cut off my presence. I am the Lord. So, notice, again, it's about separation unto the Lord. And what? And this being not being unclean is about not having the name of the Lord profaned, his holy name. His name is holy and separated, and we're to be holy and separated, and we're doing something that draws people's attention to it. We're not to live as the rest of the world. So, if one of the priests do not do all these things they got to do, they have extra things to do to get extra clean, by the way. If they don't do those things and go into the ministers of priest, they're going to be cut off from his presence. He's not going to be with them. And as we've seen, they're also going to be killed, okay? They're cut off from his presence. They're going to become into ministers before the Lord anymore. They're not going to be part of the children of Israel anymore, and they're not going to be part of this, and they're not going to be among the land of the living anymore either. So, he takes again, the Father, Yahuwah, takes again very seriously, or Yeshua, not Yeshua, Yahweh, however you prefer. It takes this name business very serious because it's tied to his name as well. Now we're going to start looking at some things that can make you unclean. And we're going to start here in Leviticus 11, 24 through verses 24 through 28. And for these you shall be unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of them shall be unclean unto the even. Whoever bears all the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean till the evening. The carcass of every beast which divides the hoofs, and not cleave, whoever chews the cud, are unclean to you. But touches them shall be unclean. Whatsoever goes on as paws among all manner beasts and all fours are unclean to you. Whosoever shall touch their carcass shall be unclean to the evening. He that bears carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the even. They are unclean unto you. Okay. First of all, earlier we mentioned unclean cattle. The word cattle there doesn't mean cows; it meant livestock. I should have brought that up, and that would include things like horses, donkeys, things like that. So the things that are unclean to eat are unclean. And when we discussed this last week, God literally calls them filth. Okay, at least they're flesh filth. But notice, you can touch them while they're alive. You can go pet your dog, or your cat, or ride your horse, or whatever the case is. And you're not unclean by touching them when they're alive. But if you touch one when they're dead, the carcass, a dead body, then the moment they die, it's unclean to even touch them. And if you touch them, you will also be unclean. And you must touch them sometimes. You find say a dead horse in the stall. You can't just leave it in the stall. You got to get that thing out somehow, and so on and so forth, and take care of its body somehow. But again, being unclean itself is not a sin. The sin is coming into the presence of God under certain circumstances while you're unclean. And remember, his presence is everywhere. So we're talking about in a special way, a way that's separated from the normal ways. That is separated from the common. So you must also be separated from the common by not having this unclean on you, being unclean. And notice now remember these animals, they call them filth. So there's an association now not just with filth, but we're talking about carcasses to their dead bodies, filth and death. And we shall see this theme continues. In Leviticus chapter 11, 31 through 34, we continue on about this, about the being made unclean by the dead body of an unclean animal. These are unclean to you all among all that creep. Whoever does touch them, when they be dead, shall be unclean to the evening. Upon whatever any of them, when they are dead, does fall, it shall be unclean. Whereas a vessel of wood, or raiment, or skin, or sack, whatsoever vessel be, where any work is done, it must be put in the water, and it shall be unclean until evening. So it shall be cleansed. In every earthen vessel where any of them falls, whatsoever it shall be unclean, you shall break it. And the meat, and all meat which shall be eaten, which is on such water comes, shall be unclean. And all drink to be drunk in every vessel shall be unclean. Okay, so notice, again, you touch the dead bodies, and this would even include, say a mosquito lands on you and you swat with your hands. You have now made yourself unclean, because while it was alive, it was not, but now you've touched its dead body. Which is, best thing to do is just not let them get on you in the first place. But so just and a person could easily do that and forget they did it. Hence, and then come into the house of the Lord if the temple was standing. Hence, sin ignorantly by coming in there in an unclean state because they just swat the mosquito and were busy and forgot about they had done it. Okay, squished it on their own skin. So. Now listen, okay, I want you to pay attention here to this. Notice that they also make things that they fall in unclean, their dead bodies. And it's vessels of wood. Now notice there's two types here. There's vessels of wood, raiment, skin, and sack means cloth. Sack's made from cloth. It must be, now that can be washed and cleansed and made clean. But it's made unclean just for them touching it. But an earthen vessel, there's no cleaning it. You have to just break it. And any food it can be in which what such water comes on, water out of one of these vessels with this dead, if the dead bug, whatever falls into your water, even though your food's clean, the water's on that food, the food is now also unclean. It would normally be clean. So you must not eat it, you must get rid of it. And we already saw the prescription is throw it in the fire, okay? And the drink must not be drank and must be poured out as well, okay? Even to recover the vessel. Now, not here in their place, the priest had this thing, and you scoured a metal vessel. And I want to bring this up because notice, so a metal vessel can be scoured, something made out of organic material can be washed, and at evening it's cleaned. And why evening? I keep saying evening because evening's the beginning of a new day, all right? His mercies are fresh every day. A new day comes. When the evening comes, the uncleanness of this day is washed away. It goes away with it. If you've washed yourself and did what, and so on and so forth. But this earthen vessels, anything that's not one of those, it includes materials like glass. I was skeptical about glass, but we had a friend who had fish we got some fish, and they said, don't put Windex on the outside of your aquarium to clean it. I'm like, why not? They said they'll leak through the glass and kill the fish. Well, it's true. Glass, despite the fact you don't see water pouring out of it, is actually somewhat porous if you look under an electron microscope. Because it's all jagged, it's actually very jagged when you look under there. And the way it is, the water can't make it out because of gravity and whatever, but it actually is. So anything like that, like a clay pot, plastic, anything that's not metal or organic material, to make it simply, cannot have the uncleanness removed from it. And this uncleanness is tied to bacteria, which cause disease. And it's true, you cannot get rid of the bacteria out of such things. And that's so yeah, so the uncleanness, that's the way you can get unclean. And if you went to somebody else's house and they had a vessel that was unclean, like one of these, they didn't throw it away. They had say a saucer and a cup, a little teacup, and they got unclean, they hadn't destroyed and done all this stuff. You again would be unclean out of ignorance. And if you go in the temple next day, you'd be sinning out of ignorance. So, and that perhaps is the reason why that's given. So perhaps a precaution, you could just make the sacrifice to begin with, to be cleansed before you ever, just in case, so you don't get in the state of sinning out of ignorance. Let's continue here in Leviticus 11:35 through 38. And everything whereupon any part of their carcass falls shall be unclean. If it be ovens or ranges or pots, they shall be broken down, for they are unclean and shall be unclean to you. Neither a fountain or water or a pit wherein there is plenty of water, it shall be clean. Oh, nevertheless, I should say, sorry. But that which touches their carcasses shall be unclean. If any other part of the carcass fall upon a sowing seed which is sown, it shall be clean. But any water put upon the seed, any part of their carcass falls thereon, it shall be unclean to you. Okay, so let's start here at the beginning. Well, it says oven. It's not talking about a metal oven like we're used to. It's not like a tandoori oven, a clay oven. Again, this non-organic, not metal material, bacteria can live in it endlessly, and the only solution is get rid of it, destroy it. I mean, broken down, so that means they don't mean taken apart, they mean destroyed, okay? And these ranges, again, not a range like you think of a stovetop range like we're talking about. It was like a buffet thing, a long thing, and you put pots inside of it, okay? And you'd heat them up from beneath. So you gotta have more than one, pot of food cooking at once. So you gotta destroy them. They too, because food's cooked there, they gotta be gone. They gotta be gone. However, if it's a giant a fountain, because living water, it's going to carry the all the way, or a pit, a large water like a cistern, something like that, or a lake or something, then the water in it's not going to be unclean from one thing being in there. And you think about a lake or a river has unclean things at the bottom of it all the time. There's these unclean animals we talked about, crawdads and whatever, and shell and mussels and those kind of things, and they die at the bottom, and so on. So where where the filth is, like the bottom feeders, like catfish, right, or things that live in the bottom or go around walking in it. That's what uncleanness is, okay? But the water above there is high enough, far enough away, the bacteria just can't travel endlessly or whatever. So you can get it off the top, and you're gonna be fine. Just don't get it near the unclean thing. Now we get to seed. Now, first, the sowing seed is seed that's dry, that is not germinated yet. So you find them. You're going out to go sow your seed, and you find a dead mouse in your feed sack. Just try not to touch the mouse and get rid of the mouse, but you can go ahead and sow the seed. It's fine. However, if water's already put on the seed, or their carcasses there, and water's came upon it, and the seed's gotten wet, now it's not fine. And the reason is it started germinating, and now that it is opened up, and the bacteria that was being kept out by the hard shell is now able to come in. So that seed, even though the seed would be clean normally, would not be clean. So that part, it's near their carcass, you gotta get rid of it. And again, if it's a whole sack, you don't have to get rid of the whole sack, but you do have to kind of scoop around the part where in my example there, where the mouse is, and not just get the mouse out and then scoop around where the mouse was and throw out that part as well. The part where their carcass fell on. And if you're in doubt, throw out the whole sack. But you can probably salvage most of the sack if you're careful. Okay, now we're continue on things that can make you unclean. Leviticus chapter 11 again. We're going to continue on verses 39 through 43. And if any beast which you eat die, he that touches the carcass there shall be unclean until evening. He that eats the carcass of it shall wash his clothes, and shall be unclean until evening. He that bears the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean to even. And every creeping that creeps upon the earth is an abomination. It shall not be eaten. And whatsoever goes upon the belly, from whatsoever goes upon all four, and whatsoever has more feet than four, has more feet among all creeping things that creep upon the earth, them you shall not eat. They're an abomination. You shall not make yourself abominable with any creeping that creeps, neither shall you make yourselves unclean with them, that you should be defiled thereby. Okay, and we'll look at the context of that in a moment, but there's the point. Now notice a beast that you may eat dies. First of all, if it dies on its own, the rule is it's unclean to you, but you can give it to some stranger among you, someone who's not part of this special people, who's not separated out. They're allowed to eat it, but you're not to eat it. You're part of this special people, which, as I brought up before, in the kingdom, it's optional. It doesn't say if you are a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and keep the least of the commandments and teach others to do them, you'll be great in the kingdom of God. It just says it, period. Okay, it's never about the flesh. It's not about ancestry. But if you're going to be in that group, if you're going to be circumcised and dare to keep the whole law, then you cannot eat that. However, notice if it's an animal that you eat, it doesn't specify how they die. It doesn't necessarily tell them when it died on its own. Perhaps it's dead because, well, you killed it, okay? Because you're butchering it. And notice that dead animal, you bear the carcass of it, you're going to be unclean. So even a clean animal can make you unclean if you get rid of the by virtue of being dead. Okay. Now notice it's not the meat later that's unclean. It's because they got parts of the animal you just throw away and you don't eat. As we discussed before, you don't eat their dung, you don't eat their poop, that is to say. You basically everything inside the gut cavity has to go out. All the organs, that kind of thing. This is why when people clean fish, the fish is literally cleanable, not clean. Cleanable would be a more accurate translation. The Greek actually calls them that, as opposed to uncleanable from pollution for unclean. The Greek words in the Septuagint. When we talk about cleaning fish, what do we mean? We're getting rid of the scales, get rid of all the parts you shouldn't eat, and we get rid of everything in the gut cavity. So it's that process, because it's unclean when it dies, all that stuff's in there. When you clean it, you got rid of all that stuff. Now the rest of it's clean, okay? But nonetheless, if you're involved in that, say you're a butcher, and you're involved in killing the animal and getting rid of all that stuff, you're unclean. And again, you wash your clothes, and if you just help carry it around, you're still unclean. So you wash your clothes and again till evening. Now, however, things that you may not eat, they're always going to make you unclean. And again, remember the word abomination here. I haven't looked here, but it's the same as the one we looked at before. It literally means filthy. They are filth, okay? So, if you eat them, you're going to make yourself filthy as well. And you're going to become unclean, and you're going to be defiled. And again, why defiled? Because you agreed to keep the whole law. And if you agree to keep the whole law, then you have to not eat unclean things. And if you do, you've broken your covenant. You're clearly part of this group, the kingdom within the kingdom, that the part of people that's going to rule over all the other people in the world to come. But it requires extra separation to separate yourself from other people, to be closer to God. And now you've broken that, and you are therefore defiled if you're in that group. And we'll look at that a little closer, as we shall see. Now we continue on here in Leviticus 20, 24 through 27. But I've said unto you, you shall inherit the land. I'll give it unto you to possess it, a land that flows with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, which has separated you from other people. You shall therefore put a difference between clean beasts and unclean beasts, between unclean fowls and clean. You shall not make your souls abominable by beast or by fowl, or by any living thing that creeps on the ground, which is separated from as unclean. You shall be holy unto me, for I the Lord am holy, and have severed you from all other people, that you should be mine. And a man or woman has a familiar spirit, or as a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. Okay, so notice this business about clean, unclean is for those who are part of that kingdom within the kingdom, which was, which is originally sent. I mean, it was always open to everyone. I could prove that, but it particularly was to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what's the point of this thing? You're going to be separated to separate from all other people. So there's other people on the earth, but you're going to be separate from them. Therefore, he requires you to separate yourself in some manners. And these things that are filth, you're not to eat them. So if you do eat them, because of your separation, just like Samson, it wasn't wrong to have your hair cut, but it was wrong for Samson because he has a Nazirite vow not to cut his hair or his beard or drink wine. Now, none of those things were wrong in themselves, cutting your hair, your beard, or drinking wine, but they were wrong for Samson because he separated himself out as a Nazirite. Through a Nazirite vow had been separated out. Same thing. If you've been separated out as one of these people, you're agreeing to not eat those things. And if you eat those things, you're making yourself, your soul's abominable. Your soul's not abominable because you ate those things per se. They're abominable because you ate them when you agreed to not eat them. When you agree to be part of this special people and take them and do the things that separate you, including not eating the things he calls filth. And lastly, I want you to notice it ends this passage about this unclean thing with this thing about a man that's a wizard, a familiar spirit or a wizard, as a familiar spirit or a wizard. So that's someone that's dealing with demons. So there's a connection between cleanness, uncleanness, and demons. And this is the first hint of that, perhaps. And we'll look at that a little deeper. Now we're looking at something else, another type of filth that can make you unclean. And that's in Deuteronomy 23, verses 12 through 14. You shall have a place without the camp, whether you shall go forth abroad, where you shall go forth abroad. You shall have a panel upon your weapons. Be when you ease yourself abroad, that you dig therewith, turn back and cover that which comes from you. For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to give up your enemies for you. Therefore your camp shall be holy. He shall know unclean thing in you and turn away from you. All right, it's talking about your bowel movement, your poop. What do you want to say when you do a number 2? Notice you can't go around. No, the thing is, when it's inside you, you're not unclean. When it comes outside of you, it is unclean. It is filth. And what's the instructions? Outside the camp. And yes, even today, armies and armies of the American army and stuff particularly has first thing doing except a camp. They dig a latrine outside the area where the camp's going to be. It's not just because the smell's bad, which it can be, but it's because of this. Even they don't realize they're just doing it out of tradition at this point. A paddle, a shovel, and people used to carry a little floating shovel in the army with them in their backpack. And the reason was so they could do this. So they're out in the middle of nowhere. They dug a little hole, took care of their business, covered it up. So why? Because there'll be no unclean thing in you. The unclean thing here is the poop. All right. God is holy. There's nothing unclean in him. Therefore, if you come in your camp, you can't be unclean in it as well. So you don't want him turning away from you. He is holy, so you gotta make sure you do this. Now, this brings up some interesting points right here. I talked about the latrine, as it's called, had to be outside the camp, but also before modern plumbing, people built outhouses. They didn't just build them out away from their regular house because of the smell. I mean, sometimes there was a fairly good, like when I grew up, there was 50 feet or maybe 100 feet from the house, which was very inconvenient in the winter, and there's snow on the ground, by the way, so think of when you had like 2 foot of snow or something, you had to dig it, get a little trench and open, you could hold it till you got into the outhouse. Anyways, because of this, that's why they did that. But even inside of a house today, now it's not unusual for a Jewish house to have a mezuzah on the front door, but some put them on every bed, on the door of every room in the house, except the bathroom. And the reason is the bathroom is considered an unclean place. And the reason it's considered unclean is because your filth, your poop, is taken care of in there. And also your other unclean, anything else might make you unclean, you wash in there into the washroom, right? And you shower in there. So the point is to get the filth off you. So the thought is the room is now filthy because you got filth off, you got uncleanness off you in there, and you got your filth, you're the unclean thing out of you in the bathroom. So uncleanness is associated with filth, we've seen. And it's contagious, and we've already seen that. So that has some implications on its own, the fact it's contagious. And we'll look at what those are, right, and what that means in terms of with respect to the temple and the tavern and the holy place and everything right now. Leviticus chapter 16, 13 through 16. He shall put incense upon the fire for the Lord, and the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat that is upon the testimony, that he die not. And he shall take the blood of the bullock and sprinkle his fingers upon the mercy seat, where before the mercy seat shall he sprinkle the blood with his finger 7 times. They shall kill the goat of the sin offering as before the people, and bring bringeth blood within the veil, and do that with the blood as he did with the blood of the bullock, and sprinkle it upon the mercy seat and before the mercy seat. He shall make an atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel, because of their transgressions and all their sins. And so shall he do for the tabernacle of the congregation, which remains among them in the midst of their uncleanness. Okay, notice the atonement is not at this point for the people of Israel. It's for the holy place itself, the Holy of Holies. Why does it need that? Because the uncleanness of the children of Israel. You have a crowd of the Temple Mount in King Herod's in the days of Yeshua, well, 300,000 people. It and Circus Maximus were kind of tied for the largest place on earth. And put this in perspective, daring place on earth. And put this in perspective, the largest stadium in the U.S., sports stadium, holds 110,000 people. Okay, I have a crowd that big, even when you consider the ones who are just in the court of the Israelites, which held several tens of thousands of people by itself. Somebody is going to be in there ignorantly unclean. And uncleanness, we noted, is transferred. So because it's transferred, they could have made a priest, someone unclean, made a priest unclean. And the priest is now touching these things. These things now need this uncleanness removed from them. And how that's done is with the blood. Without the remission of sin, there is no remission of sin without blood. Okay, without the shedding of blood. So therefore, the holy place itself has to be made clean because the people using it have uncleanness on them, even if they're ignorant of it and don't know it. We continue on Leviticus chapter 16, verses 17 through 20. And there shall be no man in the tabernacle of the congregation when he goes in to make an atonement in the holy place till they come out. And have made atonement for himself and for his household, for all the congregation of Israel. He shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord, make an atonement for it, and shall take the blood of the bullock and the blood of the goat, and put it upon the horns of the altar round about. He shall sprinkle the blood upon it with his finger 7 times, and cleanse it, and hallow it from the uncleanness of the children of Israel. And he's made an end of reconciling the holy place, the tabernacle, the altar. Then in the altar he shall bring the live goat. Okay, so notice, after he made atonement for the holy place, he doesn't make an atonement for himself. Okay, he makes an atonement, and so he's got to get the holy place itself has to be cleaned of uncleanness. Then himself can be unclean in this household, the killing of Israel. So the uncleanness is being pushed out, if you will, away from the Ark of the Covenant, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, being pushed out. And notice the congregation of Israel. We're talking about the courtyard of the Israelites again, not the court of the Gentiles. Okay. So when all this is made, now he can proceed with the rest of the Day of Atonement concerning the scapegoat, because it has to be hollowed, separated from the uncleanness of the children of Israel, which again they could bring into him quite by accident. And now we're going to look at the priests themselves, how they even have a higher level of separation when it comes to uncleanness, to being clean, than the regular people. Leviticus chapter 22, 4 through 7. Whatsoever man, and what man soever the seed of Aaron is a leper, as a ring, shall not eat the holy things to be clean. Whosoever touches anything unclean that is unclean by the dead, or man that gives seed, whose seed goes from him. Whosoever touches creeping things is made unclean, or of a man who may take uncleanness, whose uncleanness he has. The soul which touches any such shall be unclean till evening, and shall not eat of the holy things, lest he wash his flesh with water. And when the sun is go down, he shall be clean. Afterwards, eat the holy things, because it is his food. So this is all the priests themselves. And they alone had certain food they could eat. It was their portion. And when they're doing it, they're sharing a meal with God now, like communion. is but this is more separated. It's them and God alone, the priest, as to say, the priest collectively and God alone. Not even the rest of the people, the children of Israel, can participate in this. Not even the rest of the Levites can participate in this. But they have to be in a clean state when they do it. If they're not clean, they're not to do it. And as we saw earlier, if they violate this, they're going to be put out of the priesthood. They're going to be cast part of the children of Israel anymore. They're going to be taken off the face of the earth. Okay. So this is a particularly holy. This food, they got to be clean. These food they're eating is called the holy things, not because the shoulder and what the part of the animal they're eating or the bread or the showbread, whatever is holy by itself, but it's holy because of where it's at, because of association. It's as if they're sharing a meal with God Himself. Okay, that's what makes it holy. Nonetheless, this is how they eat. This is how they survive. So when evening comes, he's gonna wash his flesh with water again. Notice, take a bath, and when evening comes, he can come in there and eat because, well, a man has to eat. And this is their only source of food. When they're following what the law says, we're doing things every the way that the Lord instructed. Now we're going to look some more about this of unclean and how it affects even us today. It affects us in other ways, which we'll talk about future lessons, but how it affects us even today. In Numbers 9, 10 through 13. Speaking of the children of Israel, saying, if any man of you or your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey far off, when he shall keep the Passover of the Lord, the 14th day of the second month of the evening they shall keep it, eat with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat none of it till morning, nor break any bone of it. According to the ordinance of the Passover, they shall keep it. But the man that is clean is not in a journey, and forbears to keep the Passover, even the same so shall be cut off among his people. Because he brought not the offering of the Lord in his appointed season, that man shall bear his sin. Okay, so if you've been circumcised and you're obligated to keep the whole law, you are required to keep Passover. If you don't, you're not going to count the middle. You're not going to count as part of the kingdom within the kingdom. You can't just claim it and say, "Well, I got the right ancestor," or whatever. You actually have to keep Passover. You have to be circumcised and keep Passover. You can also be that you're going to be killed as well, as we mentioned. Okay. So God takes this very serious about keeping Passover, so much so it's the only holiday with a makeup holiday. And we see a new aspect here of being unclean now that we touched upon once or twice, but now we're going to zero in on, and that's being unclean by reason of a dead body. How does a dead body make you unclean? I mean, under what circumstances, except? And we're going to look at that right now. It means the dead body of a person, by the way, not the sheep you sacrificed or whatever. Okay, for Passover. So let's continue on. Numbers, same book, Numbers chapter 19 now, verse 11 through 13. He that touches the dead body of a man shall be unclean 7 days. He shall pure himself with it on the third day, and on the seventh day shall be clean. He pure himself and not with the third day, and the seventh day shall not be clean. Whosoever touches the body of any man that is dead, and purifies not himself, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. That so shall be cut off from Israel, because the water of separation is not sprinkled upon him. He shall be unclean. His uncleanness is yet upon him. Okay, remember, you can't go into the tabernacle, which means at the very least the court of the Israelites. The Gentiles may be people who don't know anything in the court of the Israelites. I mean, Gentiles could be their first time, don't know anything. But the court of the Israelites, in closer to the Holy of Holies, the tabernacle, that area, you're going to be cut off from Israel. And again, very least not counted as part of the kingdom within the kingdom, possibly killed. Because why? You touched an undead body, and what's the procedure? You have to wash yourself with the water of separation that's made from the ashes of a red heifer. You have to be sprinkled with that twice. Notice, on the third day and the seventh day. And that third day speaks of the resurrection of Messiah, who cleansed us from our sin. And the seventh day speaks of his reign, the millennial reign of his, when all the earth will rest under his millennial reign. And that which is clean, that which is unclean will be not allowed, particularly in the kingdom within the kingdom. So, but notice if he just tries to purify himself on the seventh day, he's not going to be clean if he didn't do the third day. And so is it us. We can't claim that people are going to somehow become part of the millennial kingdom of Messiah by being Torah observant without being purified from their sin by the blood of Messiah. So, and again, so you got to clean yourself. You got to get clean. It takes 7 days if you touch a dead body. But this requires some more explanation about this dead body business, because it's beyond just touching the dead body. Numbers chapter 19, verses 14 through 16. This is the law when a man dies in a tent. All that come in the tent, and all that's in the tent, shall be unclean 7 days. And every open vessel which has no covering bound upon it is unclean. Whoever touches anything that's slain with a sword in the open field, or a dead body, or a bone of a man, or of a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. Okay, so if you're in the same tent as the dead body, particularly there when they die, like I was with my mother, you are unclean. And you're unclean for a week, for 7 days. We just talked about that. And with respect to the tabernacle, if it was standing and you were going to try to go in it, you have to get purified of the water for, the water of separation. And notice there's an open vessel that doesn't have a lid on it. It's unclean. And again, the same rules we saw before apply. If that open vessel is organic or metal, it can be cleansed by being scoured with hot water and whatever, and so on and so forth, and washed and rinsed, and it's unclean till evening. If it's not, if it's any other material like glass or whatever, say a flower vase, it's unclean and has to be destroyed, because death is there. And notice, even when it touched the slain with a sword in open fields, every time King David, or whoever, when people fought, toe to toe, up close and personal, and they killed the opponent, they were generally touching that one, or they came by, they touched them later. Perhaps they went through to get the spoil off the dead, to see what things they could get from their dead bodies, anything like that, or a dead body in general. Right, where it's a mortician taking care of the dead body, so it can be the funeral, or people, or the staff, or whoever, or the bone of a man. Notice even his even that bone is unclean, or a grave, and you're unclean for 7 days. So here's the thing: unclean is associated not with just filth, but with filth and death as well. And we saw there's a connection between those wizards and those with familiar spirits is tied into this as well. We'll unravel that in a moment. But this thing about the grave, I mean, think about it. This means hospitals can be unclean. You go to visit in the hospital. How do you know someone didn't die in one of the rooms? And then they went and wheeled them into the elevator, and the way they did it, the way they did my mother-in-law, they put her into it just looked like a food service tray, and they had a little cardboard thing over, and you couldn't tell there was a body in there. And they went to the elevator. Now that room's unclean, and so on and so forth. You come in an hour later and walk through it. See how easy it is to get unclean unintentionally? Because again, remember, things are unclean till sundown, right? So just something as simple as that can get you unclean, because if you're where the body was, you're unclean. Also, notice the thing about the grave. in the older graveyards, they have foot markers as well as headstones. And the reason is to show you where the grave ends. So there's a little space between the headstone of one row and the foot marker of the next row. So there's a place for you to walk without stepping on a grave. And I was always told as a kid not to step on graves and so on, but no one really gave us a good answer of why you didn't step on graves, okay? Well, this is why. It'll make you unclean. So the Father definitely does not want people to be unclean. It's a big deal with him, particularly if you're going to come into his presence and meet him in a special way, in a separated way where you're getting closer to him. And being unclean really comes from associated with death and filth, as we've seen. You know, filthy things that you're not to eat, filthy things like the poop that comes out of you, okay? Filth and dead things, even things that are clean, even a dead person. So we'll make you unclean. And why is God so harsh against this uncleanness thing? Because the source of uncleanness is why. We'll look at that now. Mark 1:23 through 27. There was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. He cried, "Let us alone. What do we do with you, you Jesus of Nazareth? Are you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Hold your peace and come out of him." And when the unclean spirit had torn him and cried in a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed so much they questioned themselves, "What is this thing? What new doctrine is this? For with authority, he even commands the unclean spirits, they do obey him." Notice the man's unclean, the spirit's unclean. And that, again, that's that same Greek word, akathartos, uncleanable from pollution. And the one place they are spoken of figuratively as filthy birds, unclean and filthy birds. Okay, compared to like vultures and whatever, they eat dead things. These are demons, devils. Remember, and that's who the familiar spirit are connected with devils, with demons. Uncleanness comes from these demons, but it goes deeper than that. In Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, we get some more insight to this. For as much as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he himself also took likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver them who fought through fear of death were all our time subject to bondage. Lifetime were subject to bondage. For he verily took not on him the nature of angels, but took on the seed of Abraham. Wherever all things it behooved him to be made like his brother, he might be merciful and faithful high priest in all things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. So, who has the power of death? The devil, Hasatan. Death is associated with Satan. Uncleanness is associated with Satan. God is holy, wants nothing to do with Satan, wants nothing from Satan in his presence, particularly in a place with his name's associated with. You don't want them mixed up, you don't want them confused, okay? And when this uncleanness is being done, like we saw when they're atoning for the temple itself, for the holy of holies itself, it's pushing out in the spirit realm these unclean spirits and this death. And remember, uncleanness is associated with filth and death, and they come from and filth comes from the demons who get their power from the devil, who has the power of death. Death came in the world through sin, but that sin came in through the temptation of Satan. Death is his realm. And our high priest has to cleanse us from this. He cleanses us from sin, yes. We have to be cleansed from sin because sin ultimately came from the same place as death. He has to make a reconciliation for us because of that. But this is why God's so hard against uncleanness. So harsh. So you might think he's harsh about it. In Leviticus chapter 20, 13 through 14, we see that uncleanness is going to be done away with before the new heaven and earth are revealed. The earth, the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell were delivered to the dead which were in them. They were judged and men according to their works. And death and hell were cast in the lake of fire. This is the second death. So there's a place for uncleanness in the world to come, for death and the demons. The lake of fire was made for Satan and his angels, and all those that follow him, demons included. Remember, the unclean thing we saw, like the meat that became unclean by something falling on it, like saying a bug fell on it or whatever, was to be thrown in the fire. Uncleanness is such an abomination to the Lord because it comes from Satan, who's an abomination. And this has caused people to realize this has caused people to say, well, I should just basically never leave my house, whatever, should certainly never do anything where, or knowing I do something where I could become unclean. And they, and they get to the point where they're afraid to get around anybody, anything like that. And that's also from Satan, as we're going to see, because all fear is from him. And we're going to look at Yeshua, our example, to help us rightly judge, to judge righteous judgment, who showed us the way to keep God's law as God intended, and see what he did concerning keeping himself from being unclean. Luke chapter 7, verse 11 through 15. And it came to pass the day after, they went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and much people. When he came into the city, the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people were with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said unto her, weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. He said, young man, I say unto you, arise. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. Notice, remember, you're not to touch a dead body. These things in open vessels, whatever. He touches the bier, which is what they're carrying the dead body on, which is arguably unclean of itself, okay? And that being the case, he made himself unclean. For what purpose? Because unclean, again, is not sin. What sin is coming into the temple, into the areas separated, the sanctified, and separated with uncleanness on you. That's sin. But he had compassion on this woman. And why? Think about this. There's no Social Security back in the day. When people got old, their thing was for the children to take care of them. If the husband died, the widow woman, she really had to rely on her children. This woman only had one son, and he was dead. It's not compassion on the dead man. I mean, if he was good with God, he was better off dead, okay? It's compassion on the mother. She's got nobody to take care of in her old age. She's presumably too old to remarry and have more children. So, Jesus touches the bier, arguably making himself unclean because he has compassion for this woman. That's what Yeshua did, or Yeshua if you prefer the Aramaic, and we should keep that in mind too, not to let us be afraid of doing anything because it might become unclean. But we're going to look at an even more certain case here in the next chapter of Luke chapter 8, and starting verses 49 through 51. And while he yet spake, there come one from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, your daughter is dead. Trouble not the master. And when Jesus heard it, he answered him, said, fear not, believe only, she shall be made whole. When he come to the house, he suffered no man go in, save Peter, James, and John, the father and the mother of the maiden. Remember, you're not supposed to go in the tent where the dead person was or is. So Jesus definitely violated that, Yeshua, because he's coming here to help this man. He's not carelessly or casually making himself unclean, but he is making himself unclean to help someone who's in dire need. His daughter is dead, as it says. Now, they say, well, maybe you went in the same room or whatever. Well, let's continue on and see what else he did. Luke chapter 8, verses 52 through 55. All wept and bewailed her. And he said, weep not, she is not dead, but sleeps. They laughed in the scorn, knowing that she was dead. And he put them out and took her by the hand, saying, Maid, arise. And her spirit came in again. And she rose straightway, and he commanded to give her meat, which means food again. You see meat in King James, it doesn't mean flesh and animal, so it means food generally. So, she's dead. There's no doubt she's dead. The mourners know death. He knows life, but they know death. And notice, he took her by the hand. He touched a dead body. There is no doubt he made himself unclean for this woman, for this little girl, for the sake of her parents. And then he called, saying, Maid, arise. Then she came alive again. Now, if he had made her alive first and then took her hand, you might be able to say, well, he didn't touch a dead body, but he did touch a dead body. He definitely made himself unclean to take care of other people. So the moral here is for us, we should never be so afraid of becoming unclean. We should certainly avoid it as much as possible, because as I've mentioned numerous times, those things that make you unclean, there's a factor of bacteria and stuff involved as well. There's a physical aspect that can lead to sickness. And we should certainly avoid that, of course, where we can. But we're not to avoid contacting people and helping people in the name of not becoming unclean. We're to love people as we love ourselves. And Yeshua showed us this. He valued helping people above never becoming unclean by touching unclean people, or people in an unclean state. I should perhaps say it that way. And neither should we. That's all I have for this week. Until next week, shalom.